And in addition, of course, we had in Europe also constitutional courts all around Europe, setting clear red lines for surveillance measures throughout the last years. And especially when it comes to long retention periods for personal information of non-suspects, and also so-called profiling techniques. This is because Europe has. This is not because Europe has unbalanced privacy laws, I think. This is a result of the constitutions and human rights treaties emerged from a devastating presence of fascism and dictatorship in almost all the European countries throughout the 20th century. And I think that this, especially me as a German, is affecting very much. I mean, especially as a German, I'm deeply thankful for the American people that they helped us to overcome the dark times in history. I mean, it's very important that we, and I always, when I came to politics and when I came to my engagement, I always was affected by this American view on having a free individual and a free society where we all can have freedom of speech and so on. And I as I already told when I was here in Washington, I myself grew up a few kilometers from the inner German border, and I know what it meant to live at the end of the world, and and on the other side the people were not free. And I mean, at that time, and after, for example, the Second World War, we Germans and also the Europeans have sworn never again. And this means not only never again there should be violence and mass murder, but also never again there should be repressed and unfree people in Europe. And I just tell you this because I think that what we are struggling for today is exactly this. And I don't say, I mean, the EU states and the United States are far away from these horror scenarios, I have to say clearly. But people trust the institutions, and they think data processing technology cannot lead to harm. But I can say Germans and Romanians and Italians and Portuguese, they all trusted their governments, and they all these governments, or they all got dictatorships from time to time. And computerized data procession also, I mean, was also used by the Nazis, for example. And I think to get, for example, the Jews in Europe. And I think that these horrible examples from the past we shouldn't forget, and it's very important therefore that we have to build common rules and common standards to protect these liberties and protect these values. And this is especially because I think we should create a society in an effective and sustainable way, which really gives us the pure opportunity to not invest much money in surveillance measures, but use all this money, for example, to invest it in real important programs like social security and education and so on. And therefore, I'm, as the rapporteur for the new agreement on data protection between the EU-US, not willing to fight out any clash of civilizations between the EU and the US, but I have a clear position in between this policy field which we are, but, and we have to build up common rules between the EU and the US, because if we watch the global perspective, if we watch the worldwide development, then we have to set up high standards and good rules to preserve our values which we share on both sides of the Atlantic. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. I should say that it's my fault for not following this closely enough. The phrase clash of civilizations actually had a question mark behind it after it at one point. Somehow that got dropped, and I should have forgot that. But how are we doing here? Okay.
Thank you so much, Barry, and thank you for hosting us and for having us. This is a really important dialogue, and I echo Jan Philipp's comments. I'm going to have a small caveat, which is that because I just filled in for David at the last minute, I am going to have to step out a little early, and it's not because I can't take the questions, but it is instead I have another conflict, actually another speaking engagement. So if there are areas where you want to follow up, please reach out to me directly, mary.ellen.callahan@dhs.gov. So I just wanted to let you know as I storm out of here at 10:20 or so, it's not because I'm not enjoying the conversation. And I'm looking forward to seeing the Vice President's comments, but at the same time, I think that Jan Philipp has done a great job of setting the stage and talking about the different elements that we're dealing with on the government-to-government exchange of information. And I wanted to just hit a couple of themes and make sure that my colleagues have time to discuss as well. I think it's really important to remember that we really do have very similar principles for data protection or privacy, whichever way you want to call it, and that the principles are indeed very similar. If you look at the OECD, which of course is derived initially from the HEW principles that many of you of course are familiar with and that Cam referenced earlier, and that we've had indeed decades of successful information sharing with member states and with the United States. We recognize the OECD principles are fair information practice principles derived from the Privacy Act and kind of codified by the Department of Homeland Security, I think in a pretty robust way, are all the same basic principles and tenet. With that said, I think we need to think about, the clash of civilizations. I had a similar reaction to Jan Philipp. I'm like, it's not really a clash. It's like we're family, right? And family sometimes has different approaches to different things. And one thing I want the audience to think about is I think one of the reasons why we have a difference in application of these principles is we have different governmental structures. Right? Obviously, the European system is primarily a parliamentary-based system where the executive is also the ruling party or ruling parties within the legislature, and I think that's an important element to think about, and also explains why they're so focused on an independent data protection commissioner, whether that's on the law enforcement side or that's on the commercial side. Usually their data protection commissioners serve both roles. In the U.S. system, as we all know, there are very robust 3 branches, all very active in their different elements. And I think Congress made a decision, with the support actually of several people in this room, to first create my office, the Chief Privacy Officer for the Department of Homeland Security, and then to encourage privacy officers in each department. And the idea there being is that we would work beforehand to make sure that privacy principles are embedded within the system, but then also to look after the fact. I've just written a report actually talking about how I investigated our Inspector General for a data breach. Cam was talking about data breaches and how important they are. And I think that that's an important element, but not a dispositive element of privacy protection. But to get the privacy protections in up front, and then also to look at them after the fact. With that said, there is, of course, a great deal of oversight in the United States system, including, of course, the U.S. Congress and the courts, but more specifically, the Government Accountability Office and our own Office of Inspector General, who has indeed investigated me. So it's a little bit of a quid pro quo, and I think those are important elements to think about when we talk about working within a system or working without a system. Briefly, I want to talk about the US-EU negotiations, but I can't say too much because they are indeed ongoing. But they are indeed intended to establish mutual recognition for the US and the EU frameworks for privacy through the acknowledgement of common baseline standards for protection of information, exchange for law enforcement, criminal justice, and public security protections, and for public security purposes, excuse me. And as Jan Philipp said, our principles are very similar, and these are based on the high-level contact group principles, and I think that that's important. One thing I wanted to kind of differ a little bit with, Barry was talking about how a lot of it is commercial data. That's certainly true in the passenger name records circumstance, which are your records associated with that you provide to the airline that are then conveyed to the United States pursuant to the Aviation Transportation Security Act of 2001. And we are also in negotiations with that to revitalize a provisional 2007 agreement. In that circumstance, that is indeed commercial data initially provided to the airline, but then provided to the United States pursuant to its border authority. much of the other law enforcement information that the umbrella agreement, that's what I'm calling it, or data protection and privacy agreement, DPPA, too many acronyms, so I'm just going to call it the umbrella data protection agreement. Those elements primarily aren't commercial data, and maybe I'm missing something, Barry, but I just wanted to kind of distinguish that. With that said, as he said, having a framework in which to engage in government-to-government sharing is very important to the United States, and important to have that framework and to be the leader with our European colleagues in terms of government information sharing. And I'll stop at that and look forward to questions.
Thank you. I'm told that we almost have Vice President Redding's statement downloaded, but thank you very much, Mary Ellen. The next speaker is Edward Hasbrook, who many of you know as the practical nomad and travel expert, but who I think is here today on behalf of the Identity Project. And Edward is a great authority, particularly on questions of national name record. There are other questions. Edward, you've got about 12 minutes.
Thank you very much, Barry, and thank you, Mary Ellen and Frank and Jan for all being here. I want to talk a little bit about what this umbrella agreement, I think as Mary Ellen accurately called it, is, whose interests it serves, and what would be needed to move it forward, and if I have time, some more specific suggestions about what ought to be included in it. From the start, I think that there's an asymmetry in public and political debate about this issue, which reflects an underlying legal asymmetry in the proposed so-called agreement itself. We don't have anybody from Congress here. Many of you probably were unaware that this is going on. There is essentially no public debate about this in the US, even while it is the subject of active debate in the European Parliament. Why is that? That is because from the US side, what is being proposed, or what is intended to be proposed, will be, or signed, will be a so-called executive agreement, not a treaty, so that it can be negotiated in secret. It will not be presented to the Senate for ratification, and it will not be binding on the US or enforceable through any legal mechanism in the US. It will have no legal force or effect. From the US side, it will be a press release. However, because it actually will be binding on the European Union, it will have to be approved by the European Parliament, and they're already involved, and there'll have to be a public political debate about it. That asymmetry has very important implications. And of course, DHS or the President cannot bind Congress to take any action. We've already seen in the case of passenger name record data and the parallel negotiations for a similar executive agreement there, Congress has stepped in only to enact a resolution saying we are not going to change any US law with respect to passenger name record data. We're not prepared to give on that.